Yo, it's Dohrok here, and today we're going to talk about Deathblades a little bit. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been running a new build on my Deathblades, and I've had a pretty fair amount of questions about it on my stream over at twitch.tv/DJ Dohrok. So today, I want to do a bit of a deep dive into what this build is about, what's changed from the current meta build, is dropping Spincutter worth it, does this even do any more damage? I'm first going to say that I did not originally think to do this. This isn't my original build. This was shown to me as a build that Powder Snow had been running recently on KR, and it piqued my interest quite a bit. I've seen very little information about this build, so I'm putting together my thoughts and experience here so you guys can decide if this seems like a good fit for you. But I'm going to be leaning towards something along the lines of this build becoming more of a standard at a very high level of play though. And since Deathblade has a notoriously high number of parsers, it may be something to help give you a little bit of a competitive edge. First, let's talk about what's different than the current meta build for RE Blade. I'm going to be focusing more on the differences since what's currently meta generally has decent information available for it online. The most obvious here will be that Spincutter has been dropped for Blitz Rush. The reason here being that between the mobility of your T skill, Twin Shadows, and Surge, there just isn't a need for an extra movement ability. I personally had removed the synergy off Spincutter a while back and instead placed it onto Turning Slash. Doing so let us take Swift Fingers on Spincutter, making it a very fast mobility skill with a really good amount of distance. But that's all it is at that point. Most people I would say ran a Bleed rune on this, so it could be used to apply Bleed. Some people ran Gale Wind to make it even faster. But the bottom line is that it doesn't do damage and it doesn't gain much meter. In the current meta build, if you're fluidly going through your rotation as a Deathblade, then you will most likely encounter periods where all you can do is Spincutter to build meter. This isn't really ideal since Spincutter does very little damage, and you would just be sacrificing your movement skill cooldown to not move. The aim of this new build is to just take away that downtime and fill it with as much DPS as possible. This is not done simply by changing Spincutter to Blitz Rush and calling it a day, however. There are some other notable changes that may be refined as this build is, but after a fair amount of experimentation, I've landed on enjoying the idea of farming as much meter as possible with this build and just pump as many surges out as we can. As a summary of everything that I've changed, I currently have Wealth runes running on nearly everything except for a Gale Wind on Death Sentence and Earthcleaver, and a Focus rune on Maelstrom. I have also swapped my Arc passive to max out Orb Circulation and swapped 2 points into Release Potential on the Leap Tree. I previously was running Raid Captain, but I swapped to Cursed Doll as well, but I think it's probably better to run Raid Captain. There is also a gem adjustment to accommodate the new skill. This is done with changing our cooldown gems to just Maelstrom, Turning Slash, and Blitz Rush, and damage gems on all 8 abilities. The reason for these arc passive and rune changes really falls into the rotation itself. There's a bit more thought involved in the rotation than previously. As a general rule, Deathblades want to build 100% meter as efficiently as possible, meaning with as little overcap and as quickly as possible. This is so that we can surge as much as possible with as little interruptions. Surge is our bread and butter. Unless you're running that weird supercharged Blitz Rush build, then I kind of recommend swapping away from that. Which I've had some comments on why I wouldn't run the charge enhancement tripod on Blitz Rush. This tripod just makes it do 40% more damage per charge level, and then there's 2 charge levels. I think the charge just feels really bad to use even with a Gale Wind, and it slows the rotation down significantly, which hasn't proven to give any actual better DPS. This build's rotation essentially has 2 ideal avenues to surge, each one taking about 3 to 4 seconds to execute, including the surge cast. This can rather increase the amount of surges you're pulling from the previous meta build, which has slightly slower ideal meter gem times by about 20%. 7 to 8 surges a minute is not unreasonable with this build, even on Brel Gate 2. For any future reference, a surge rotation is going to be the set of skills used from one surge to another. The rotation still mostly functions on priority, however, the most important thing here is that I cannot Soul Absorber and Void Strike in the same surge rotation. Doing so will result in a period where all of your cooldowns will be on cooldown for a short time period. It's not the end of the world if this happens in a boss fight, but ideally it doesn't need to happen, and practice makes perfect here. Every rotation I will try to start with Maelstrom, Turning Slash, and then either Soul Absorber or Void Strike depending on which one I previously used. Soul Absorber will take the priority when starting the fight as it does more damage. Following that opener, there is a priority in meter generation. Deathly Slash is going to be priority number 1, your T skill, and it should basically be used on cooldown. Death Sentence is priority number 2, and it should be used every surge rotation. Blitz Rush would be priority number 3, and will be used just about every surge rotation. Number 4 would be Twin Shadows, and then following that would be Earth Cleaver. Once you've reached 100% meter though, and you can surge, you should surge and start a new rotation. You will not need to go through all of your abilities to reach 100% meter. And if your T skill is off cooldown, you may not need to Blitz Rush on a rotation with Soul Absorber and Death Sentence, for example. But as long as you alternate the start of your surge rotation with Soul Absorber or Void Strike, you should never have downtime on your skills. There are some general patterns in the rotation that you'll get the hang of with practice, but listing every scenario here might be a bit of an overload. There is a catch to this though. I personally do have a level 10 tier 4 cooldown gem on Blitz Rush. Having a level 10 will completely round out the 0 downtime on a boss fight. I did run this with a level 8 cooldown as well, and in Trixian you can experience 0 downtime. However, in a raid, there is a higher chance of things not going perfectly, and reduced cooldown here helps quite a bit by upgrading to a level 10. You might be asking, why no cooldown gem on Soul Absorber or Void Strike though? That's because they're not necessary. Because we're alternating the start of our surge rotation with Soul Absorber or Void Strike, we're not limited in our avenue to surge by using both of them in the same surge rotation. So the cooldown reset by surging is already more than enough to alternate these skills. But then why do I run such a high level cooldown gem for Blitz Rush? Well, that's because we're trying to Blitz Rush in every single surge rotation. This is again possible with a level 8, but works significantly better with a level 10. This is why the only cooldown gems we're running are Turning Slash, Maelstrom, and Blitz Rush. These 3 abilities are used almost every surge rotation with the exception of Twin Shadows at times, but this cooldown helps give it more mobility. Death Sentence has a quick prep tripod that reduces the cooldown by 6 seconds already, which allows us to use it every surge rotation without a cooldown gem. So why do I run so many Wealth Runes and not a Gale Wind on Blitz Rush? This just works out to how well the meter gen fills up in a very efficient manner. The extra meter from the wealth lets me finish bubbles with Blitz Rush rather than spending another Twin Shadows. And generating this meter is faster than the time saved from Gale Wind on Blitz Rush. But that covers most of the basics of what's changed with the build and the rotation itself. And the number one immediate comment that I've seen from people asking me questions in my stream over at twitch.tv/DJ Dohrok is, it sounds awful to raid without Spincutter. So let's think about the pros and the cons for a second. The pros would be a higher APM and DPS rotation on a stationary target. This means higher potential overall DPS. More surges is more gooder. The rotation is also more forgiving to missing an ability as you've gained another true meter generator. And subjectively, the rotation is more fun to play. The big one being the more DPS bit. But what about the cons? Well, the only real con is losing the mobility of Spincutter. And because, like I said, the first response has always been, it sounds awful to raid without Spincutter, that's what I've been testing. Because this is what piqued my interest to begin with. Because how many of my Spincutters during a fight are actually used for movement? And how many of them are actually needed to be used for movement? Basically, is it actually a downside to lose Spincutter? Because I thought the exact same thing initially. However, I also thought the exact same thing when removing Dark Axle from my bar. Dark Axle provided a very long distance, fast moving super armor ability that went over bosses. To me, this move was perfect for every time a Khan would dash away from me to do an attack, or every time Theamine would dash away from me to do an attack, or anytime Echidna would dash away from me to do an attack, or any of the bosses would dash away from me to do an attack. I never thought to replace Dark Axle at all. However, with the introduction of Arc Passive, RE Deathblade received the ability to move with their surge to where their cursor is, with extreme body movement. This entire distance moved is also super armored and can penetrate bosses. This essentially made Dark Axle obsolete, but only as long as you had a surge available when the boss moved. Reluctantly, I swapped away from Dark Axle at the very end of Tier 3, and after getting extreme body movement and having Deathly Slash, I can confidently say Dark Axle is a waste of a skill slot. And after playing with this build across all of my Deathblades, I can pretty confidently say that I don't think Spincutter is really worth a slot either, but that's with a big but. Let me explain why. With this rotation, surging 20% more means that movement from extreme body movement is also up 20% more of the time. I've also yet to have a boss dash away from me where I can't easily close the gap with either Twin Shadows, Void Strike, Deathly Slash, or Surge. Sometimes the boss turns though, and Spincutter can be useful to quickly get behind the boss. But so can walking, or surging. The time saved from Spincutter to get behind the boss is completely negligible. Now, I'm not saying this can't happen, but after raiding on 10 Deathblades, 6 of which don't even have extreme body movement, I've only run into about 2 situations where I thought, yeah, it would be nice to have Spincutter here. However, 99% of the time, I've mostly just been enjoying having Blitz Rush way more. Spincutter provides pure mobility. There is paralysis immunity on Spincutter, which Blitz Rush also has. So any ability you'd use Spincutter to tank, you can also use Blitz Rush as well. If you don't need the mobility, then Spincutter really provides no value, and that's the core of what this build is. This build increased my CPM by about 10 cast on average, which is pretty sizable for the overall rotation. Going from 6 surges a minute to 8 surges a minute just feels insanely good, and it's one of the reasons why I love RE Deathblade. I've played RE since release, because I just really enjoy the high APM melee combat style. I love hitting the boss and seeing numbers stack on top of each other with every hit. It's satisfying to me. So I love looking for ways to increase that, and I think I am probably fully committed to this build for at least a good while to continue to feel it out. On top of that, I've seen an average of a 5 to 10% DPS increase on fights, not including fights after I upgraded to a level 10 cooldown gem, so on par gear with a level 8 cooldown. For me personally, if I see a 5 to 10% damage increase, and I'm having more fun playing the build, then there's no reason for me not to play it. The one immediate change I'll be looking at more though is going back to Raid Captain instead of Cursed Doll. I've noticed that my uptime on Maelstrom has actually gone up to about 90% and even higher sometimes, and with Raid Captain, this should be a higher DPS engraving than Cursed Doll. However, should you copy this build? If you think that adding more CPM into your play is going to hinder your ability to have efficient uptime, then this might not work out for you. But from my personal experience, the hardest part about this build is not actually dropping Spincutter, it's making sure you don't Void Strike and Soul Absorber in the same surge rotation. Once you can get past that, you can flow through the rotation so smoothly that you just don't need Spincutter. You can just surge most of the time. And the kind of content you're doing is going to matter as well. Doing Theamine on a 1690 Deathblade with a group of 1690s isn't going to give Theamine much time to do anything, and you're going to be a lot more relaxed on your rotation. However, going into Act 3 Prog, it may be a bit more punishing to not have Spincutter, and your item level and gear level is going to matter as well. I don't think I can recommend you trying this build unless you try it with a minimum of having extreme body movement first from your Enlightenment tree. So I want to offer some tips on how to move around without Spincutter. Without Spincutter, I use Twin Shadows, Deathly Slash, and my Surge for movement, mostly, depending on what scenario you're in. And while I can't cover every scenario, there is a trick to these that may help you. Twin Shadows moves you forward and slashes in a cone about 270 degrees around you. It won't cover directly behind where you land, however, this move can be used at an angle from the side of a boss to behind the boss and still receive a back attack on the hit. This is incredibly useful when bosses make small adjustments or turns or even very abrupt turns to start attacks. By being able to spacebar out to the side and avoid an attack, I can Twin Shadows to quickly place myself right back behind the boss and still get the back attack from the hit. This same logic can be used with Deathly Slash. Deathly Slash hits the area where you land when you use the skill. This can be used to place your character behind the boss, while you still receive full back attacks on your Deathly Slash. Deathly Slash, however, has a slightly further travel distance and less delay in animation, and makes it pretty ideal for mid-range movement towards a boss. Obviously, your T skill isn't going to be up all of the time though. It should technically rarely be up. However, if your rotation is going well, then you should be alternating between either having a T skill available or a Surge available for any movement needs. Because Surge is providing us the ultimate movement ability of penetrating long distance super armor attack, and it always counts as a back attack, this means that there is no penalty using Surge to go through the head of a boss to get to his butt. As long as you aren't getting knocked on the ground and the boss is using his abilities to go away from you, then these three abilities really can cover a good portion of the movement that you'll need to do. But that's the big but here. The agony of the thought of losing Spincutter comes mostly from getting knocked down. If you aren't super familiar with boss patterns, this may be a lot more punishing. And if you aren't great at using your spacebar as an iframe, then this again might be even more punishing. But let's say you get knocked down with no stand-up and the boss does do an attack to get away from you. Naturally, you would probably want to Spincutter to get back to the boss. But there are moments like this where even Void Strike can provide valuable movement as well. Void Strike is one of the lowest damage output abilities in this build in my testing. It also hits at the end of the strike, and Rising Slash makes it hit again. I point this out because Void Strike will build the same amount of meter if you use it directly in front of you, or if you have to travel slightly before reaching the hit. This gives you a few walking steps of distance that you can use Void Strike without any penalty to meter gen, and can be used to finish a meter bar that a boss jumps away from so that you can surge straight through him and continue back attacks. And I know there's going to be some Deathblades out there that are going to comment, "Oh my god, why would you ever use a skill into a boss that isn't a back attack?" But the reality is that sometimes it's better to send one skill to gap close and surge behind the boss than to spend an extra 3 to 5 seconds Spincuttering around him. Especially when your surge always back attacks and provides a direct route to the back of the boss. And when looking at this data, I am just comparing myself to myself. I have 10 Deathblades that I raid on every week. I play pretty consistently when I measure myself against myself. So I'm seeing these increases across all of my characters so far. And I also have a static run that I can gather data with over the next few weeks that will help eliminate support differences in group comp and other variable pug factors. But logically, when swapping to a new build or a rotation, there's going to be a learning curve. And for me, it still took several hours before I felt comfortable playing the build in a raid. So you may perform worse if you initially decide to swap. But I highly recommend that if you do, practice it a bit before coming to a solid conclusion for yourself. Because this does require a little more skill involved, and a bit more knowledge on boss patterns to properly super armor attacks or maintain high uptimes. But for me personally, when initially swapping, I was still able to put up similar or even slightly better numbers than running the previous meta build almost immediately. This means that the absolute floor of what I was doing with this build was still on par or better than what I was doing previously. That to me tells me that there is a significant amount of potential with this build, and it will only get better the more I get used to it. So I'd have to recommend trying it, but depending on what item level your Deathblade is or gear level, you may or may not have a positive experience. This really does shine at a higher item level with your arc passive fully finished, but it's still very usable even on a 1640. But it does require a bit higher level of play, but practice makes perfect. And again, I didn't come up with this build, but this has really sparked my interest in theory crafting a bit more with builds, and I'll continue to test different rune combinations and arc passive nodes to see if I can make this even better myself. Because there is still more to play around with, and it's possible that after several weeks of raiding without Spincutter, I end up deciding that I actually did want it back. But for right now, I'm having a lot of fun without it, and if I come up with anything new or cool, I'll be sure to let you know. So if you play a Deathblade and you've tried the build, or if you enjoyed this kind of video and just talking about Deathblades, make sure you drop a comment down below, hit the subscribe button while you're down there. If you have any questions or you want to chat, feel free to join my stream over at twitch.tv/DJ Dohrok, or join my Discord and give me a ping. Until the next one, dudes. Peace!